one. But anyway, I thought it might be kind of interesting to go back and talk just a little bit about the Bay of Pigs, what will eventually lead, and we'll talk at another time about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because some of us are old enough maybe to remember the tenseness of that period in our history, and others of you have probably studied it or heard family members talk about it. I feel like my life sort of parallels our relationship with Cuba, because it was in March of 1952. I was born in September of 52, but in March of 52 is when Baptista seized power in Cuba. And he proclaimed himself to be president, and the previous president was deposed. When Baptista came to power with support from the United States, we know now, he canceled the presidential elections and he created a new system of government. And while he had a lot of support among certain segments of the Cuban population, the reality was that there were a number of people who saw what he had done as being nothing more than another one of what was then so often occurring, and that was military junta, seizing of power that was occurring across a lot of the Latin American countries. So when he comes into power, what happens is that many of his opponents then begin to join together in sort of an armed rebellion, which will eventually lead to what we in the United States refer to as the Cuban Revolution, which occurs in the 1950s. And there were a number of anti-Baptista groups, those who were opposed to his seizing of power, establishing, doing away with popular elections, basically imposing what he believed was the most appropriate systems economically and otherwise on the Cuban people. Probably the most famous of those anti-Baptista groups was a group called the 26th of July movement. I love the Latin American sort of revolutionary movements because, as a rule, they take those sorts of names the day they were founded or where they were founded, as opposed to the red, white, and right, or those sorts of things that you'll find so often in our history. But the 26th of July movement was founded by a young American-trained attorney by the name of Fidel Castro. And he organized the 26th of July movement. He did something that the other revolutionaries didn't do, which probably contributed to his success, and that was he organized it in a cell system, which meant that in each of the cells there were 10 members, but no one in each of those cells knew any members in other cells. And even though Cuba is a small island, there were numbers of cells within the 26th of July movement, but only Fidel Castro and his right-hand man, Che Guevara, knew the location of all the different cells and knew who was the leader of those individual cells. And it actually helped them be quite successful as they began to move through this revolutionary period, which was from 1956 predominantly until 1959. Utilizing guerrilla warfare, which is, of course, a technique that was used so often across the Latin American countries during not only the 20th century, but even going all the way back to the 1820s, when you had revolts with Jose de San Martin and others in Argentina and in Uruguay and Paraguay and all across South America and on up into Central America. The idea of guerrilla warfare, because they knew they didn't have the strength, nor did they have the manpower, the munitions, the ammunition, those sorts of things to be able to do a war that would be a frontline war. Guerrilla warfare would work better in Cuba. Castro sets his base up high in the mountains in Cuba, and from there they will launch their attacks against the Baptista forces. And by 1958, Baptista is in retreat. On December the 31st of 1958, on New Year's Eve, Baptista actually resigns as president of Cuba, flees to the United States in exile. And probably what really turned even those who had been loyal to Baptista against him was that when he flees, they later learned that he takes with them, in the equivalent of US dollars, he had changed all of the Cuban money into US money, for ease of transport and fleeing, that he took with him over $300 million as he went into exile. And of course, Cuba at that point was a relatively poor agrarian nation for the most part. And that really did a lot to turn a certain tide of people against Baptista. And many of those who had supported Baptista then begin to flee to the United States. There will be an exile that will come predominantly to Florida and then will begin to filter across the United States, those who are going to be targeted by the revolutionaries for execution and exile. Interestingly, Baptista leaves and Castro sets one of his buddies, a guy by the name, who was also an American trained attorney by the guy name of Manuel Lea, sets him up as president, and Castro becomes prime minister. And he did that based on his study of the European systems where there was a president and a prime minister, and realized, or a monarch and a prime minister, and realized that the true power of leadership rested with the prime minister, and that's what he's going to do. So he takes that role in February of 1959, and then he's going to announce that there will be no future elections in Cuba, that from that point on, they are going to institute what he calls direct democracy. And that means that anytime that a decision needs to be made, he's going to call the Cuban people together in mass meetings, thousands of people in stadiums. And if there is a decision to be made, they will then make the decision by either an up, or a down vote. And that's how they'll have democracy in Cuba. It's an interesting idea. It makes you think of the old Athenian system where you would vote for ostracization by tossing down the piece of broken china or whatever, and that every citizen voted on every major issue. That sort of democracy, even though communism talked about being the most democratic of systems, of course, that's not how it had manifested itself, certainly in the Soviet Union or under Maoist China, other systems, but that's at least what Castro is going to say in the beginning, is that it's going to be direct democracy. Critics, of course, said it was incredibly undemocratic because there will never be another election. Castro is going to be prime minister or presidente for life, depending on which title at which point in his life. When that happens, you're going to have a number of military counter-revolutionary groups that are going to organize in an attempt to overthrow him. And there's going to be a period of about 6 years from 1959 on where there are going to be multiple attempts to try and get Castro out of power. Some of it we know now, and looking back at the records, some of it the United States will be involved in as a part of that attempt to get Castro out. And there's a lot of discussion about why the United States was so concerned about what was going on in Cuba. And you almost have to look at it and think about it in context of the Cold War, the fact that, what we were talking about only a week ago, following World War II, you have the world basically divided into two superpower camps. Those who are, the United States is leading the free world, with our European allies, ANZAC, our Australian, New Zealand, other what were British Commonwealth countries, but primarily the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union with its allies, which included Eastern Europe, not necessarily China, because Soviet communism and Maoist communism were very, very different in the way that they manifested themselves. But the world's divided into two camps. And the United States was pretty clear, and the record shows that we know there was a relationship between Castro and the Soviet Union. So we care for a multitude of reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about several of those reasons. But what we knew was, one, at the basis of communism is the idea of worldwide domination, whether that would have ever been a possibility or not. Two, that one of the things that we felt like was beginning to happen was that the Soviets were arming Castro because of their relationship. And we'll talk in a few minutes about some things that sort of hinted pretty clearly to us that that was happening. And the other was the fact that Cuba was in such close proximity to the coastline of the United States. And you have to kind of in context remember that this is during the same period of time that Khrushchev will announce at the United Nations that the United States will eventually fall, but they will fall from within. That it will be that exported communist, it will not be the Soviet Union, it'll be an export of communist philosophy and perhaps with some assistance to Cuba. So when all of this begins to unfold, there will be anti-Castro groups that will begin to organize. And those dissidents are going to take to the mountains in Cuba. But we're also going to find that there will be the beginning of those groups kind of coming together in Florida and in other places in the southern United States where there's a large group of Cuban in exile populations. And the word gets out on the street. I always think it's funny that we say the word gets out on the street. The word gets out, and Castro is aware that there are those probably in the United States. I mean, after all, he'd gone to school here. He had a lot of contacts still in the US, that there could possibly be a future attempt on the part of the United States to remove him from power. And sort of a timetable will begin to occur where things will go bam, 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 bam. And the next thing you know, we really are sort of looking at each other suspiciously and ready to hiss. So April the 3rd of 1961, there's a bomb attack that occurs in Cuba, and it appears to have been planted by one of the dissident groups, and there are a number of the Cuban military members who are killed. When that happens, then 3 days later, Castro is alleged to have blown up the Hershey sugar factory, which was there in Cuba. It was an internal thing, kind of a strike back at the United States. So they blow up the Hershey sugar factory. Then 8 days later, you're going to have what really is sort of a spontaneous attack between Cuban government troops and one of the rebel dissident groups that is anti-Castro are actually going to meet on the battlefield in Cuba, and they're going to fight against each other. A number of the government troops are killed. A number of the dissidents are also killed, and there is worldwide coverage that this has happened. And there is an allegation that those dissidents have been trained by foreign powers, the assumption being they had been trained by the Americans. The reality is now we know that that part was not true. We will do our part in training a bunch of folks, but we didn't train those people. It wasn't until I started teaching about the Bay of Pigs, and I guess maybe because I was younger, I did not remember that on that same day, there was a Cuban airliner that was hijacked and flown to Jacksonville, Florida. And then there was a defection of a B-26 Cuban pilot and a pilot at the Miami airport. And there was this huge press conference that was giving interviews with these pilots who said, we're leaving Cuba because this is not the Cuba that we once upon a time knew. This is the Cuba, this is a Cuba that looks unlike anything in Central America. This is a Soviet imposed Cuba. And at that point, when that press conference occurs, then within days, Castro is going to start cracking down on the press in Cuba also. Hundreds of dissidents will be arrested. They'll be thrown into prison. Castro announces that unlike the Baptista regime, that his regime will not use physical torture, that they are instead going to use what he calls psychological torture. I don't know a whole lot about torture other than what I've read over the years in teaching, but I think most people would agree that psychological torture is equal or perhaps even worse than physical torture. You talk to some of the men who were in the Hanoi Hilton. We have 2 former Hanoi Hilton prisoners of war that live here in Chattanooga that don't talk about it very much, but they will occasionally mention things that went on. But he's going to say, we're not going to beat them, but we're not going to pull fingernails out and do those sorts of things, which he alleges the Baptista regime had done. But he said, we're going to use things like solitary confinement, hunger, sleep deprivation, other sorts of things, which of course we know, can lead to all sorts of issues. So while he was attempting to make it a very positive statement on a new Cuba as far as torture, most of the world wasn't particularly buying that either. Torture is torture. When some of the conservative writers in Cuba then begin to criticize him, what Castro is going to do is he's going to disband the printers union. The government is going to nationalize all of the newspapers. And from that point, all of the newspapers in Cuba are under strict control and may only print those articles that have been predetermined by the Castro regime to be appropriate articles to be printed. So that by January of 1960, Cuba is basically, there's one message, one leader, one political party. It has become a democratic society in the terms of a communist democratic society, but certainly not a lot of freedom and certainly no freedom of expression. How do the people react? What's the United States doing? Well, the United States has been watching all of this, but when that occurs, when the newspapers and everything are shut down and become really instruments or organs of the propaganda, at that point, there will be another attempt by Cubans to rise up. And when that happens, Castro declares that there are those who are loyal to Baptista that are still a part of Cuban society, and that now it's time for trials to bring justice to the Batistas who have fought against the new rule of democracy. And there will be series of trials. Interestingly, a number of them are going to occur in stadiums where they will bring forth, those who are accused of being Baptista men who were involved in torture during his presidency from 52 until he actually flees in 59. And they will hold a trial for them. The masses will either up or down, and they will actually be executed in front of the masses. And in particular, the United States will then come back, and our press will be very critical of that as not a fair trial. This is sort of like the days of bread and circuses among the Romans, the gladiator sort of thing, in that, there's no due process of law. These are mass executions that are going on. That really makes Castro angry. And Castro will come back and will begin a series of attacks against the United States in the press, holding press conferences. It'll be reported in the American press. It'll be reported in the European press. It will be, within the Soviet press and everything. And he basically will come back and say that the United States is not in a very good place to be critical of Cuba. And he begins to point at what he says is the strong racial divide in the United States, the second-class citizenship role that many African Americans have had to face in the United States, even after having served in the military. And he really, really begins to sort of turn the mirror on the United States and say, why are you being so critical of us when it comes to free speech, equality of citizenship and everything? You guys have pretty well blown a lot of this too. The trials will continue, and occasionally there will be life sentences given, but most often, those trials are going to lead to execution. By late 1960, coming into 1961, Cubans, Castro's government is going to seize the United States oil refineries that are there: Exxon, Standard Oil, Shell. He seizes those refineries, and then they will begin to process Soviet oil that's coming in on tankers. And when the United States says, wait, those are our refineries, you can't change it from processing oil for us to processing Soviet oil that will then be used in Cuba, but also will be sent to other other nations across Central America, in particular, Guatemala, El Salvador, and other areas where there's revolutionary fighting going on, then what Castro will do is just seize total and complete control. The Americans who are there running the factories and everything will be sent home, and he just seizes all of the American industry. Well, then in response to that, the United States is going to cut our exports to Cuba, cut off everything with the exception of certain foodstuffs, and medical supplies. So we begin an economic embargo, which for those of us who are my age or even younger, the economic embargo continued until just recently. There was a wonderful cartoon in Newsweek magazine years ago that was the succession of presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, all the way down through. And each of them was saying one word, and the sentence was, Cuba will fall soon because of the economic pressure from the United States. And the last picture was Castro, who was still alive at that point, just sort of grinning and smiling, going, hadn't worked just yet. So anyway, when we launch the economic embargo, then what the Cubans are going to do is they're going to turn around and they are going to take control of American small businesses that are in Cuba, 383 small businesses, along with a couple of other major businesses, including Coca-Cola and Sears Roebuck. They're going to seize both of those. And when that happens, then the United States is going to quit importing Cuban sugar, because sugar was the number one export that Cuba had. That was where most of their money came from, was the sugar plantations. So you've got the United States looking at Cuba saying, we're not buying from you anymore and we're not going to trade with you. You have Cuba saying, well, we've just taken control of all of your industries. In Cuba, we have now nationalized them and they are no longer American assets. They are now Cuban assets. And it escalates very, very quickly. And at an OAS meeting that will occur in 1960, and now remember, in 1960, Eisenhower's still president. The election will occur in November of 1960. The winner of that election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president, will then take office the final January. But in that early fall of 1960, there's an OAS, Organization of American States, meeting in which the U.S. Secretary of State basically gets up and says that Fidel Castro, and one of the quotes is following the Bolshevik pattern, that he has instituted a single party system, that he has taken control of the trade unions, he has suppressed civil liberties, he has removed freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He asserts on the floor of OAS that all of this is occurring as a puppet administration of the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union is attempting to create Cuba as a base of operation for Western Hemisphere domination. And he evokes the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, which Teddy Roosevelt had come back, and will then begin to talk about human rights violations and such. So very quickly things begin to sour. Now, what's going on during all of this period of time? So, we're looking at Cuba going, oh my gosh, it's basically a communist nation in our back door. The tremendous fear because of the Soviet refusal to withdraw from Eastern Europe. Remember that in 1950, of course, war had broken out on the Korean Peninsula, with North Korea invading South Korea, mobilizing, MacArthur and his forces, which were at that point a protectorate in Japan, and those forces had gone to South Korea and will be involved in a war for 3 years that will ultimately end basically in an armistice, a stalemate. But we saw that as an attempt of communism to spread, to dominate the Korean Peninsula. Simultaneously, Mao has gained power in 1948, actually power earlier, but has taken formal power in the late 40s. In China, we're seeing what's going on in Southeast Asia. So Cuba for us is almost like the hot spot in our own hemisphere. It really is making everyone incredibly nervous. And I guess I am old enough to remember that, of course, by the time, that we're sending troops into South Vietnam and everything, that it is that idea of the domino theory. Well, we know that in 1960 that elements within the government, some of them CIA had been formed after World War II, and CIA was the external body to kind of control what was going on in the world, where FBI was the intelligence agency within the United States. CIA was the intelligence agency looking outward and operating and attempting, and we know now, sometimes using methods that Congress was certainly not aware of, attempting to deal with what they perceived to be threats to the United States. And the Castro administration, those in charge of the CIA, felt very strongly that Castro was a threat to the United States. So we know that in March of 1960, that there were private meetings held between leaders in the CIA and the National Security Council talking about the necessity of removing Castro from power. Now, interestingly, when you go back and look at the documentation, and they were foolish enough to do some of it as documented in their minutes, there is not an explicit order that this is going to be an assassination of Castro, but what they basically say is to replace the Castro regime with one that is more focused on the interest of the Cuban people and willing to work with and be acceptable to the United States, which is sort of an interesting thing to think about too. And what is that kind of a program going to cost as they begin this, what's going to be a propaganda program, dropping of literature, flying across Cuba, bombarding, radio, what had been radio free Europe, we're going to begin to use some of in Central America and everything. And President Eisenhower approves this attempt to educate the Cuban people, to maybe ferment revolution internally, whatever, and whatever else may be necessary. We know now from the Eisenhower Presidential Library and the documents there that Eisenhower did not ever order, nor did he approve any sort of an amphibious assault on Cuba. That was never spelled out, but he did authorize $13 million to explore options for removing Castro from power. Okay. So, the CIA, we know now, began to set up training camps in Guatemala. And by November of 1960, they had organized what they believed was a small group that was capable of leading a larger group in some sort of effort against the Cubans. Now, in that context, where we are now, John Kennedy is elected president. And of course, it's one of the closest elections in the history of our nation. John Kennedy wins by 1 vote per precinct across the nation. And he comes to power. And I think that people, so often we forget now, because it has been a period of time, but we forget that John Kennedy was, one, a veteran, strong military man. And if you go back and look at his inaugural address, which quite frankly, I love, Ted Sorensen wrote it with Kennedy's, obviously his input, beautifully written inaugural address. Everybody remembers the ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. But they forget that Kennedy basically in the inaugural address to the other superpower and its allies pledges that the United States will go anywhere, fight any foe. And I mean, he goes through this whole thing basically saying, we will meet you on any battlefield anywhere in the world because we will stop the spread of communism. Now, we won't take it out of where it already is, but we will do whatever is necessary. And of course, what we know now is that almost immediately after being sworn into office, he will begin to increase forces in Southeast Asia. He is very concerned about what's going to happen in Cuba. And Kennedy will authorize a plan, and he will leave the specifics of the plan to those that have military experience, to those who are in the CIA, and the Cuban exiles who are in the United States, who have now begun to organize themselves and are anxious to go back and take their homeland. And I think it's so easy today to overlook the idea that they are exiles in a foreign land who want to go back and take their birthplace, take back their home. They're going to be led by a guy by the name of Jose Cardona. And Cardona has been in Miami. He had been a member of Castro's government. He was part of the Revolutionary Council. And then he will say that he truly believed when Castro, put Baptista out of power and Castro came to power, that it was going to be a new day for Cuba. And then he realized that if anything, they had exchanged one dictator for another dictator. And this was not the democracy that he nor his Cuban friends who were in exile, or even the mass of Cuban people, wanted. So he will agree to lead the Cubans in exile, working with the US military covertly and the CIA to come up with a plan in which they can remove Castro from power. What's interesting is all of this is supposed to be occurring covertly, but by November of 1960, as John Kennedy is being sworn in, Fidel Castro is already aware that there is some sort of a plan in motion. Doesn't know exactly what it is, but because so many of the exiles in Miami talked with each other about the plans, those conversations were overheard by those who were loyal to Castro, and the word gets back to Cuba. So shortly after John Kennedy is inaugurated, he's inaugurated January the 20th, 1961. And by February of 1961, he authorizes an invasion. Now he wants to try and disguise, I guess that's the best word I can come up with. He wants to try and disguise the fact that the United States is involved in it. Not that anybody is going to believe that, but that's one reason why they chose the Bay of Pigs as the landing place, is that he thought they could slip in there, do what they needed to do to overthrow the government. And it was such a remote, swampy, it would be sort of like invading the United States through the Everglades, and that they would not be aware that the United States was a part of that plan, that they were that. The problem is the stronghold for the anti-Castro people were in the mountains of Cuba, and they're about 50 miles away. So it's going to be difficult for them to be able to join up together and do anything. And the plan called for 2 airstrikes that would occur on Cuban air bases. Then there were going to be about 1,400 men that would, under the cover of darkness, would launch a surprise attack by landing at the Bay of Pigs, and then paratroopers were going to be dropped onto the island, and they were going to disrupt Cuban transportation. The Cuban military forces would be taken out, and simultaneously, after the Bay of Pigs landing would occur with the brigade there would be a simultaneous, a little bit later, but pretty same day, landing that would occur on the other side of the Cuban island. Well, it looks so good on paper. It looks so good on paper. And I think, so often I'm reminded, when Napoleon decides that he's going to invade Russia, his plan was that they would leave Paris, invade Russia, and be back in Paris within 6 weeks. Whomever was drawing up his plans didn't have a real good grasp of how far it was from Paris to Moscow first, how much food it would take, nor how long would that occur. Well, I think those who were drawing up the plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion, both in the exile and in the American community, had no idea how difficult that the actual invasion was going to be. So, what happens is they decide that they're invading April the 15th of 1961. So there are 9 bombers that are going to leave Nicaragua, and they're going to bomb the Cuban airfields. Now, the CIA had purchased those 9 bombers were World War II B-26 planes, which they had painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes so that they could get into Cuban airspace. And by the time the Cuban Defense Forces recognized that they weren't their planes, because that was more planes than they had around, they would be able to bomb, and it would all be done. Well, the problem is, as they are flying to Cuba, there are photos made of them flying in formation toward Cuba. And as people began to really examine the photographs, they realized that those are US planes that have been painted to look like Cuban planes. And, you know, so that they are all shot down. All nine planes are shot down. President Kennedy cancels the second airstrike because it's not going to work. The next day, Brigade 2506, which was the Bay of Pigs invasion, lands, and immediately they come under heavy fire because somehow the word had arrived in Cuba that that's where they were going to land. Cuban planes will fly and they will use their guns to spray the invaders as they are coming ashore. They will sink 2 of the ships. They destroy half of the air support that is attempting to give some coverage to the Bay of Pigs invaders. And then the weather turns bad. It rains. The equipment gets stuck in the mud. They don't have enough ammunition, and it is just a royal mess. Absolutely a royal mess. During the next 24 hours, Castro will order 20,000 troops to advance toward the beach, and the Cuban Air Force will keep just literally flying and spraying back and forth with gunfire. President Kennedy is alerted that it's an unmitigated disaster, and he authorizes an attempt to save them that will occur at sunrise on April the 19th. He's going to send 6 American fighter planes, which, as it turns out, is what my friend, those of you that were with me earlier, was on one of those planes. They will head toward Cuba. They're going to offer supporting fire, but they will get the word to turn around and come back before they actually get within Cuban airspace, because the intelligence comes back and tells them that basically it has already been lost. The invasion has been crushed. It's over and done with. So the US planes will circle and come back to Homestead. Now, a few of Brigade 2506 will go back out to sea. The rest of them are going to be killed, or they're going to be rounded up and they're going to be imprisoned. About 1,200 members of the brigade will surrender. More than 100 of them that are identified as leaders will be executed right there on the spot. It is, as word gets around the world of what has happened, and John Kennedy, to his credit, says, yes, the United States was attempting to support freedom fighters. And he says something to the effect of, every great victory has 1,000 people who claim credit. Disaster, there's only one, and I am the person who was in charge. I take full responsibility. So, that in itself was a pretty strong statement coming from a man who's only been in office, 3 months at that point. So what happens in the aftermath, as I'm looking at our time? Those 1,100 prisoners are going to be held for about 20 months as the United States attempts to negotiate a deal with Castro, a way to bring them back to their families, most of whom are in the United States. So they are alien residents. They may have not have attained citizenship yet, but they were, in American protectorate sort of citizens because of what they're doing. Robert Kennedy will actually begin, and he will go to different American pharmaceuticals, baby food producers, all of these different companies, and he will go to them and basically work out private deals so that it's not US dollars, it's not government taxpayer dollars, but ultimately the deal that will be worked out is that in exchange for the release of those 1,100 prisoners, American companies and private individuals who have given money will exchange for those prisoners what is about $53 million worth of food, medical supplies, other things that the Cubans are desperately in need of. And with that, of course, Castro will claim victory. You know, Cuba, this small island nation in the Caribbean, has repulsed the mighty United States. And not only that, we've made them pay our price. So, you know, December of 1962, if we think ahead, October of 62 will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happens with the Bay of Pigs is it will launch us into a period of escalated tension between the United States and Cuba that will ultimately come to that showdown in October of 62, the 13 days. And, you know, and I do, even as a child, remember the tenseness, because I remember there being extra prayer sessions in churches around my small community during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What we know now and what occurred at that point was when those exiled prisoners got back to the United States, when they land back in the United States, that was that December of 1962, John Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy will fly to Florida. They will meet those returned prisoners of war, basically, in a huge public event that occurs in Miami's Orange Bowl Stadium. I don't remember this happening when it did, although the history books, you know, tell the total story and everything. I just don't remember it being covered in the press, and I'm sure it must have been. But they will meet. And one of the things that John Kennedy says to those former 20-month prisoners of war in Havana is he will take the Cuban flag, the free Cuban flag, will hoist it above his head. And let me read the quote exactly. He says, "I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade, 2506, in a free Havana shortly." Well, of course, that doesn't happen. The Bay of Pigs really had turned the tide as far as the U.S. involvement with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, we felt as though we were on the brink of nuclear war for that period of time, you know, that it was who was going to blink first. And all the attempts that go on behind the scenes at the United Nations with Adlai Stevenson calling out the Soviets, finally being able to show the pictures of the missile launchers and the bases in Cuba that we were able to get, having lost a plane and having lost 2 pilots trying to get that information and everything, Cuba becomes this for, I think, the United States and for the government, and whether it was Democratic or Republican, what you're going to see is that following Bay of Pigs, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba is this blemish on this threat because of its close proximity to us of communism within our own sphere of influence, in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, in violation of the Roosevelt Corollary. And, you know, for every decade after that, until the recent sort of lifting to where there is some travel and some trade that's going on, but even still, it's not a normal relationship. Cuba has been that one hotspot in the Western Hemisphere that the United States has struggled with, and that every president since Eisenhower and Kennedy has dealt with. And if you think about it, you know, 1952, almost 69 years ago, Cuba has been an issue that we've had to deal with. And, you know, you mentioned the Bay of Pigs, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you haven't seen 13 Days in October, I think is the name of the movie. It's Kevin Costner plays O'Donnell. There are some liberties in the movie, but it gives you a pretty good scenario of how the Cuban Missile Crisis will play out. But there was, and most military historians agree, there was that moment for about 48 hours when truly we believed that we were on the brink of nuclear disaster and nuclear war, and that it didn't really matter who struck first, that when it was all over, it would literally all be over, because we had developed our weaponry to the point that there would be no survivors, or that the earth would be so contaminated that it would be the end of civilization as we know it. So, wow, it's hard to believe, that it was 60 years ago this month that the Bay of Pigs occurred. And then within, only 18 months later, then the October crisis. And then by December, the exiles are home. And we as a government pledged that we would support the return of a free Cuba. And here we are, almost 69 years later, and the situation is very much the same. The only difference in power is that it's not Fidel Castro and it's not Raul, and of course Che Guevara is gone, but the government is much the same. And we are at 5:23, 7 minutes. Yay! We're getting a little bit better. It's just, and it's interesting for those of us that have Cuban American friends, and I have a really good friend that I taught with at GPS who her family she and her sister sent them to the United States at the time that all of this was occurring. She got here in 59. Her mother, about 3 years later, joined them. Her father was never able to leave Cuba. And as long as it's been, if she and I get into a conversation about Cuba, about the Bay of Pigs, about the status in Cuba, I mean, she still cries. And the idea, and our last conversation, I said, now that they've opened up a little, do you have any desire to go home? Because she still has some family there. And she said, no, she didn't think she could. It would be too painful. It would be too painful because she had lost so many people. When she came to the U.S. in 59, she never saw her father again. They were never allowed to have any communication, even after her mother joined her. So, you hear a lot of conversation among the Cuban American community, still that pain of being in exile. For the want of a better word, they still consider themselves to be a people in exile, even though they may be second and third generation in this country now. It's one of those periods in history that you just look at and kind of marvel at how much power the CIA had, quite frankly, at that point too, but how close the showdown came, and how the world could have been so much different had it gone in another direction. I mean, it's just fascinating. So anyway, talk to me. Anyone old enough to remember any of this, or am I the old soul again? Yes, Susie, thank you for making me feel better that you remember.
I'm a year ahead of you.
Okay. Well, then.
And I had Cuban friends that went to Brainerd High School that had come and were there, and I was friends with at school.
Well, and the friend that I was referring to was Elvia Piccolo, who taught Spanish at GPS for so long.
Right, yeah. I remember her.
And you just think about that fleeing. It's kind of like some of our Chinese American citizens who fled China after Tiananmen Square and some of the things that have occurred. And you think how difficult it must be to leave your homeland because of
or the North Vietnamese who I have
so many.
We're from North Vietnam.
Exactly.
They are here and have been here many, many years, of course, and they still feel, that homeland. Their son has gone back and visited.
See, it's hard to imagine how much that would probably tear at your heart.
That would, yeah.
It would, if you couldn't go home again. Well, anyone else?
I think one of the things that's somewhat strikingly different about this is that we live in a time where news is 24/7, and you have untold number of news sources to go to. And honestly, many of those sources aren't news, they're opinion.
Exactly.
When this all took place 70 years ago, you either got it from Walter Cronkite or you got it from Chet Huntley and David
Brinkley.
or your local newspaper. And those news people weren't allowed to opinionize.
Right.
It was just the facts, ma'am.
And it was.
And you had to digest that yourself and come up with your own opinions about it. So much of the tenseness in that period of time between the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis was people arriving at that on their own, really. You got the facts, and then you had to figure out what to do with it. And that's a big difference in how we relate to things today.
Yeah, but we all
That's,
knew
that's
about
such an important point.
hiding underneath the desks and everything.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question. I don't know where I got this factoid from, but they percolate, and it's the librarian in me, I guess. I get all these little useless facts in my brain.
Librarians are wonderful.
Was one of the issues, and again, I haven't fact checked this, that in the CIA that there was a spy who was part of Castro's regime. Is that correct?
And that is what I have read says yes, but they always use him by code name as though not to give him any credit.
Oh, okay.
To make him notorious, but yes. And so he was well aware of all the plans. And, a number of those who were a part of 2506 that came back said, obviously he knew because they landed and marched right into the guns.
Right.
And marched into the planes. And there was no chance that they were going to be successful and very little chance of survival. And, it's one of those situations where I think you're right too in, what we knew most of as people were trying to put this all together. So many of the people who were listening to the news, listening to Walter Cronkite or Chet Huntley and David Brinkley were World War II veterans or they were Korean War veterans. They had seen the face of war. They had seen what had happened following World War II with communism and where today I think there's a more casual, cavalier sort of thought about the world, two camps in the world and we're at each other. For them, it was very real because they had lived through it previously. So I think they were able to imagine how bad that it could get and that it might get. That's such an important point that you made and I have to tell you that there are days that I sometimes wish we could go back to just the reporting of the news. And occasionally I can remember Howard K. Smith, which must have been CBS, occasionally would do a report and they would put a little thing up that would say Howard K. Smith editorial.
Right.
And he would, say, here's what I think about this, but it was very clearly identified where today it's
It's part of it.
Yeah, you just have to kind of figure out what's fact and what's opinion and are there political leanings based on different news outlets or whatever. It so much has changed.
You have to assume there are political leanings. I mean, you just assume that there are.
There are, and I love sometimes to switch back and forth between the stations and hear the same story being reported on different stations so that I can go, okay.
Yeah.
figure it all out because the truth is in there somewhere probably. Now I just have to figure it out, which is of course what our parents and grandparents were having to do with very little information, with a lot of silence. And of course the TV stations went off at midnight.
Yeah,
it was just all over. Well, we are at 5:30 and you all are wonderful.